So I do want to welcome everybody who has joined us for tonight's virtual presentation, Separate Vessels, Haudenosaunee Engagement with the Dutch of New Netherland, 1609 to 1664, with our guest speaker, John Parmenter. For those of you who don't know me, I am Patrick Stenchorn. I am the Director of Interpretive Programs at the Albany Institute of History and Art. If at any point during today's presentation you have any technical issues, please feel free to send me a direct message in the chat box, and I will do my best to help troubleshoot any issues that you might be having during this evening's program. For tonight's presentation, please make sure that your microphone is on mute. If you are using a device with a webcam on it, please feel free to have that turned on or off, whichever is most comfortable for you. We will conduct a question and answer session at the end of today's presentation or tonight's presentation. So if you do have a question for Dr. Parmenter, please type it into the chat box and I will then moderate all questions at the end. With that sort of housekeeping all taken care of, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker tonight. John Parmenter is an associate professor of history at Cornell University. He is a historian of colonial North America, specializing in the history of indigenous peoples in the Northeast, particularly that of the Haudenosaunee. He received his BA and MA in history at what is now Western University in London, Ontario, Canada, and his doctorate from the University of Michigan. Parmenter's first book, The Edge of the Woods, Iroquois, 1534 to 1701, was published in 2010 with the support of a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship. And his current research interests include the historical experience of allied Indian nations in the 7 Years' War and American Revolution, the impact of the US-Canada border on Native American nations, and contemporary Haudenosaunee nation building initiatives. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Parmenter.
Great. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Patrick, and thanks to all of you for attending tonight. I really appreciate it. So tonight I'm going to be talking not only about the history of Dutch relations with Haudenosaunee or Iroquois, and I'll use those terms interchangeably, but also about how the memory of that relationship has functioned historically. And my hope is to promote some thought about how this history has been written, what counts as evidence, and how these issues have changed over time. I'm going to cheat a bit and I'm going to go beyond the chronological boundaries that I set up in the title. I'm going to go take you to 1909 and the Hudson tricentennial for a few minutes, and then we're going to go back to the 17th century and end up in the 21st. Okay, it's one thing I like to do with my students is to try and show them that all this stuff that happened 400 years ago still has some resonance in the here and now. So in 1909, with the Hudson Fulton Centennial that was held in Manhattan, Native people had kind of an uncertain place. They couldn't put them in the category of old families of New York. They couldn't put them in the category of members of the leading patriotic and hereditary societies. They couldn't put them in one of the multiple nationalities composing the cosmopolitan population of the state. So they put them at the end of the parade in a vague category called other nations, behind the members of various ethnic societies in the order of procession, which would mark, I think, their ineligibility for hyphenated American status at the time. That said, it was pretty clear that the organizers of the parade paid a great deal of attention to how they wanted to see Native people represented. The Aboriginal people of New York State were represented, as the phrase goes, by 70 real Iroquois Indians, men, women, and children, who were secured for the commission by one F.E. Moore, who then had the Native people take characters on floats representing what was referred to as the Indian period. These Indians, it says in the report, dressed in their picturesque Native costumes and still speaking the language of their ancestors, were the objects of intense interest alike to the American spectators and to the official representatives of foreign nations at the parade's court of honor, before whom they executed a ceremonial dance. And when you look at the different pictures of the parade floats, you can kind of see how the organizers of the parade tried to provide a kind of moving tableau of memorable scenes in the history of both New York City and the broader state. There's predictable events depicted, like Minuit's Purchase of 1626, Bronx Treaty of 1639. Not so predictable were some of the floats commemorating other aspects of New York's native history. And the Haudenosaunee contingent actually placed special emphasis on representations of the traditional founding of the Iroquois League, an assertion of nationhood that seems clear in retrospect, if not necessarily so for contemporary non-native audiences, and one that stood in stark contrast to the confinement they endured on reservations within New York State at that time. Once the parade ended, the Haudenosaunee performers remained in New York City for another week, offering ceremonial dances at dedications of various parks and historical monuments. The organizer of the commemoration commission, Edward Hageman Hall, was at great pains to assure the crowds that these were actual, really native people, not, as he said, white people painted up for this occasion. And he marked, his choice of Haudenosaunee performers on his perception of their perceived ascendancy over other nations in New York, in what's now New York State. The pinnacle dramatic moment, I think, that happened for Haudenosaunee people in the tricentennial came at what was called a naval fete held at Columbia University on the 2nd of October, 1909. And here, the organizer, that Mr. Moore, who basically got the troupe of 70 performers together, reenacted a scene. And I want to just read the quote here of how it's described, because I think it's actually quite interesting. So Mr. Moore appeared dressed in the style of Henry Hudson's time and impersonating the navigator, walking toward the Indians, extended to them a friendly greeting. Sitting down in their midst, he solemnly accepted the pipe of peace and offered as gifts strings of bright colored beads, which were received with manifestations of delight and passed from hand to hand. And then it says, for a moment, those who could forget their very modern surroundings were transported back to the faraway past. And the report of the commission doesn't really tell us the extent of control Native people had over the content of their appearances, but I think we should allow for at least the strong possibility that those performers in 1909 were attempting to make manifest that very faraway moment, one that articulated their memory of their relationship with the Dutch, and that would later serve as a diplomatic blueprint for their foreign relations with other European colonizers. The scene might seem a little patronizing at first, Indians seemingly delighted by trinkets, but everything else about the scene suggests a particular consciousness of the Haudenosaunee people about the legacy of their relationship with the Dutch. And I would argue that the representation of separate nationhood in the parade, the selection of content in the floats, the reenactment of the scene with Moore as Hudson, I think reveal that consciousness to us, even if it was, so to speak, hiding in plain sight at the time. So there's no dancers here tonight. I'm perhaps in a disadvantage compared to Mr. Moore, but what I do want to persuade you of this evening is the urgent need for us to reverse the usual trajectory of colonial history, one in which settlers arrive, most Native people die, those few who survive undergo dramatic cultural change and then disappear. And consider instead an alternative viewpoint, one that attends to the influences Indigenous people exerted on the entangled cross-cultural relations that prevailed in Hudson's wake in what's now New York. And doing so, I would contend, facilitates a better appreciation of history as lived for all parties concerned. And that appreciation is really the first step toward an escape from a persistent colonial mindset that emphasizes only the effects of colonization on Native people to the exclusion of any consideration of the ways in which Native polities shaped the experience of settler colonies in early North America. So in order to accomplish that, we need to broaden our perspective on what counts as evidence from an exclusive focus on written documents to include both the material record from archaeology and related aspects of, in this case, Haudenosaunee oral tradition. So what you see on the screen is a picture of a two-row wampum belt, one that's meant to embody a relationship that is referred to by contemporary Haudenosaunee people as Gaswenta. Okay, it's how they represent and manifest their idea of their relationship to European colonizers. So what you see here is a long beaded belt that consists mostly of white wampum with two parallel lines of purple going along its lengths. The lines of purple are meant to symbolize the distinct identity of the two peoples and a mutual agreement to coexist in peace without interference in the other's affairs. So what you have with Gaswenta is a separate but equal relationship between two entities based on mutual benefit and mutual respect for each constituent's political integrity. Europeans remain in their ships, metaphorically speaking. The Haudenosaunee remain in their canoes, metaphorically speaking. Neither side may attempt to steer or control the vessel of the other as it travels along its own self-determined path. Okay, so that's kind of a material depiction of an idea. Okay, and where does it come from? Contemporary Haudenosaunee oral tradition associates the original elaboration of this agreement between Mohawks and the Dutch with an agreement that happened sometime around 1613. Mohawks and a Dutch ship captain trader named Jacob Eelkens met outside of what's now Albany, Normanskill Creek. Interestingly, at a time when trade could have been taking place between Europeans in a ship and indigenous people in canoes. And Haudenosaunee scholars over the last 20 years have consistently asserted the historical veracity of this oral tradition as a founding moment in colonial era treaty negotiations. And they've actually increasingly pointed to the utility of the concept of Gaswenta as articulated in the two-row belt as a model for repairing indigenous settler relationships in contemporary North America. What's been interesting on the flip side of this is to see the reaction of non-native scholars, for the most part, to this idea. And for many years, including up to the present day, in some places, it's been kind of dismissed as a legitimate historical phenomenon. Okay, people have questioned the authenticity of a document purporting to represent the so-called treaty from which the two-row belt emerges. Okay, recent scholarship, I think, has confirmed earlier research that the alleged parchment document that is supposed to represent this treaty was in fact a 20th century forgery. Okay, that's been reason for some scholars to dismiss the concept out of hand. Another historian about 15 years ago wrote an article that talked about the two-row treaty as a 19th century verbalization of an idea that may have existed earlier, but the author claimed there was no particular evidence for it. And then the author went on to sort of warn contemporary people against trying to use any of the concepts here to advance any kind of political claim, given its perplexing origins and so-called ambiguous status. And when I read that article, it sort of puzzled me because when I was researching my book, I actually had come across a number of times where this agreement was referred to. Okay, and when I actually sat down and mapped it out and looked at it, I actually was able to identify 19 different documented recitations of the tradition associated with this wampum belt and that story in the documentary record, some by Haudenosaunee speakers, some by European speakers, that span almost a 100-year period between 1656 and 1755. And in another article that I wrote, I talk a bit more about the importance of the written evidence in support of Iroquois oral tradition. But what I took away from that was how important it is, I think, for us to kind of challenge contemporary scholarly opinion that says this is something that's invented. This is something that's perhaps even fraudulent. Okay. I would argue, and I'm going to argue as I move forward here this evening, that we can actually learn a great deal about the character of early Dutch relations with the Haudenosaunee by integrating this knowledge from oral tradition with more commonly used bodies of evidence, such as documents and archaeological data. So I'm not going to go through all 19 recitations. That would be very tedious. Some of them are richer than others. A very kind of interesting one that I will just sort of share with you here dates from 1689, and it appears in a speech by a Haudenosaunee delegation visiting Albany. And they essentially sort of remind the authorities in Albany at that time that in former times, they said Mohawks, Oneidas, and Onondagas, and those would be the three easternmost nations at the time, as they said, did carry the anchor of the ship that Jacques, which is believed to be a reference to Jacob Wilkins. They carried the anchor of the ship to Onondaga, that being the meeting place of the Five Nations. And they basically were coming back to Albany now in 1689 to renew the old covenant made with Jacques many years ago, who came with a ship into their waters and received them as brethren. And then the Mohawks, Oneidas, and Onondagas desired him to establish himself in this country. And the Senecas and Cayugas drew into that general covenant, and they had with one accord planted the tree of good understanding. So that's kind of one of the examples that led me to believe that this is actually something that is quite real, that was operative in the minds of people at the time, and it's something that deserves paying attention to. Okay. These verbalizations or documented recitations of the tradition, I think, offer quite strong support for remarkable consistency over a very long period of time by Haudenosaunee speakers and today in the 21st century scholars. Okay. So what we're going to do for a few minutes is kind of a bit of a review of some of the evidence of Haudenosaunee relations with the Dutch from the time of first contact, and try and see how awareness of the notion of Gaswenta can help us understand how those relationships were built and the effort that Haudenosaunee people put into trying to convey these ideas, not only to the Dutch, but as we'll see, to their various colonial successors right down to the present day. In September of 1609, Henry Hudson's voyage took him as far upriver as Norman's Kill, south of modern day Albany, and 50 miles at that point or so from the easternmost extant Mohawk villages. We know that Hudson spent 3 days trading with indigenous peoples in the area. These were likely Mohawks. They're not mentioned by name in Dutch written sources until 1614, but new archaeological evidence, in fact, quite new archaeological evidence that just came out earlier this year, is suggesting extensive Mohawk involvement in the Hudson River Valley trade as early as 1611. There's been some new radiocarbon dating done that is actually helped us pinpoint the dates a lot better than they were previously identified as. And after which, the rapid movement of what one scholar has called a tidal wave of Dutch trade goods into Iroquois country as far west as the Senecas, who were then residing in the vicinity of what's now Rochester. Okay, so the establishment of a regular Dutch presence in the Hudson River Valley after about 1613 gave the Haudenosaunee a crucial opportunity to extend pre-existing patterns of trade and alliance building to these newcomers, using their own methods of peacemaking, or some call it foreign relations, to articulate terms of solidarity between themselves and the Dutch newcomers. The founding moment for the Gaswenta Agreement, as we've seen, likely took place at some point prior to the formal establishment of Dutch Fort Nassau on what was then Castle Island at the outlet of Norman's Kill in 1614. You can see on the map, there's what was then a little island, and the landing point is kind of identified in red on the map. This is the Vingboons map of early New Netherland. Okay, it's detail from it. And I think what people sort of sometimes get hung up on is what exactly was the nature of this agreement? Okay, was it a formal treaty? Could a Dutch ship captain sign a formal treaty? Well, I don't know that there were necessarily any kind of documents exchanged, and calling it a treaty might be a bit ambitious. But I think what clearly was established here, and what the important thing to bear in mind is that there was some kind of agreement established between Mohawk people and Dutch representatives that basically established the terms for doing business with one another, and gave people the sense that they could move securely back and forth to a particular place and do business with one another. Okay, these concepts are pretty common among indigenous communities prior to contact, from what we can tell archaeologically. And it's not surprising to see Mohawks kind of extending this hospitality, this relationship, these terms to new arrivals who brought interesting stuff with them and who didn't seem to ask much in return. They wanted to do business. Okay, so for a few years, Fort Nassau exists on Castle Island. It's sort of washed away in a flood in 1618. The Dutch presence on the upper Hudson assumed a bit more of an intermittent and unreliable character for a while after that, and proportionately their relations with the Haudenosaunee suffered. In 1622, for example, a Dutch trader named Hans Joris Hontem, a longtime associate of Eelkens, who actually did possess significant North American experience, for reasons unknown, took an unnamed Mohawk sachem, as it said, a leader, a chief, hostage and demanded a ransom. After the Mohawks dutifully paid the ransom, Hontem reportedly, the document said, cut out the male organs of the aforesaid chief and hung them on the mast stay with rope, and in this manner killed the sachem. So this act, about as overt a rejection of Goswenta principles as exists in the documentary record, really cast a pall over Iroquois relations with the Dutch for about another decade. When the Dutch came back and reestablished themselves at Fort Orange in 1624, Haudenosaunee observers, noting the invitations issued by Mahikins to northern Algonquin and Montana trading partners to bring their peltry to Fort Orange, quickly surmised that if the Mahikins, their competition, were successful, they would link regional supplies of peltry that otherwise would have been traded to the French in the St. Lawrence Valley with Dutch trade goods, which included notably the highly desired shell wampum that was chronically scarce in New France. So the Iroquois, particularly the Mohawks, decided that it was important to undertake a campaign to displace their Mohican rivals from the vicinity of Fort Orange and assert direct access to the Dutch traders for themselves. Okay, this was not a petty squabble. Several wider Haudenosaunee political and economic objectives were actually in play in what's often called the Mohawk-Mohican War. Okay, it had tremendous benefits for the Haudenosaunee. For example, obtaining a very important alternative to French markets in the St. Lawrence River Valley. Okay, securing the power to broker other nations' access to Dutch trade goods. And internally, it was a good test of promises of mutual defense that were made in the latter stages of the internal formation of the Iroquois League itself. Okay, although all the five nations shared a collective interest in challenging what the Mahikins were trying to do with Fort Orange, the Mohawks ended up doing most, not all, but most of the fighting. After an initial Mohawk offensive in 1624, the Mahikins actually were able, possibly with the assistance of allied Montagnais and Algonquins, to inflict severe damage on the Mohawks. The easternmost Mohawk village was destroyed at some point, either in very late 1625 or early 1626. The Mohawks, undaunted, kind of rebuilt their villages on the south side of the Mohawk River, closer still to Fort Orange than they had been. before this, and this prompted the Mahikins to recruit the assistance of Dutch soldiers from Fort Orange to try and push the Mohawks out. And this was kind of the one time that the Dutch engaged in military action against the Haudenosaunee, and it did not go well for them. Early in 1626, just less than 3 miles out of Fort Orange, the Dutch commander Daniel van Kriekenbeck ran into a Mohawk ambush with his Mohican allies. 4 Dutch soldiers, including Kriekenbeck, were killed, and the Mohawks basically disarticulated several of the Dutch soldiers and carried limbs home back to their villages, as the document says, as a sign they had conquered their enemies. Several days later, when a Dutch trader went out to the Mohawks to cautiously ask what was happening, he was asked the reason why the Dutch had meddled, as the word said, the document says, in their conflict with the Mahikins. Okay, Dutch meddling, notwithstanding official West India Company recommendations to the contrary, continued until the Mohawks defeated and dispersed the Mahikins in 1628. After that, relations kind of cooled down, and the Dutch basically acclimated themselves to a primary economic relationship with the Mohawks at Fort Orange. Okay, the Mohawks were still very interested in holding the Dutch to acceptable standards of behavior. And when a Mohawk leader named Sagadriokta discovered that Hontum, the murderer, had been appointed to the position of the commissary of Fort Orange in 1633, 900 Haudenosaunee warriors appeared at Fort Orange demanding his surrender. Hontum refused to leave, and the assembled Haudenosaunee army vented their anger by burning a West India Company sloop, slaughtering all the livestock on Rensselaerswyck, Killian van Rensselaer's patroonship, and diverting much of their trade traffic away from Fort Orange as a result of that particular action. And that prompted the next kind of interesting episode where you see the Dutch and the Haudenosaunee beginning to kind of rebuild their relationships. Okay, in the dead of winter, 1634, 1635, the Dutch sent Fort Orange's barber surgeon, a guy named Harman Menderts van de Bogart, and 2 of his associates out to eastern Iroquois to ask what the reasons were for the decline in Iroquois trade at Fort Orange. And it's a fascinating text, very skillfully edited and published. It's available. And what's interesting to see within that is how Van den Bogart and 2 of his associates get a very interesting refresher on Goswenta from their Oneida hosts at the town of Oneutahaga on the 3rd of January, 1635. So they're at the tail end of their journey. You can see on the map, it's the westernmost point of their travel. And basically this is where they have their big audience with the Oneidas and Mohawks, and the answer to their question is given. The Oneida speaker essentially says, we'll do business with you, but we want this as an established price. 4 hands of seawant. That's a measure, that's a set, that's basically about the length of a man's hand of shell wampum, and 4 hands of long cloth for each large beaver pelt. This actually, when you look at the prices for pelts at the time, would have been a significant increase in their buying power at Fort Orange. But they did say that if we get this, we will do business with no one else. Okay, so they essentially offer Van den Bogart, they communicate to him a deal and make arrangements, and essentially say that if you guys agree to this, this is all the benefits that are going to flow from it. You're going to be able to come into our country, experience hospitality at any of our settlements. Okay, what's it going to be? And Van den Bogart hesitated, claiming to lack the authority to arrange the prices of goods, but he did promise to report their request to his superiors and to return the following spring with an answer. Okay, and I wanted to just show here for a second. This is a page that actually depicts that scene I just described from a nonfiction historical comic book that was written by a guy named George O'Connor. It was published in 2006. by, I think it's a graphic novel publisher called First Second Publishers. It's a very, very interesting representation of a historical text, where the author uses a quite lively visual imagination to flesh out an historical document. The depictions are cartoonish. The Mohawks are represented in the book as foreign, intimidating, hard to interpret, and insistent on their customs, just as the Dutch saw them. Okay. And in the comic version, you know, I think the author is quite successful in depicting how the Dutch characters in the narrative return to Albany and Fort Orange, I should say, having lost some of their complacency about their familiar way of life. Okay, so I just threw that in there so people could see an example of that, and I'm happy to provide the information on that later if anyone's interested in it. I think it's still in print. I'm not 100% sure. Despite Van den Bogaert's effort, relations between the Mohawks and the Dutch remained kind of chilly throughout the mid 1630s. Van den Bogaert never went back with an answer. In 1636, Van Rensselaer reported persistent Mohawk antagonism toward Fort Orange and the settlers of his proprietary manor. He didn't like the way they were acting. They seemed threatening. He failed to draw the connection between what he perceived as Mohawk sentiment and his own efforts to collect an indemnity from them for the property they had destroyed in 1633. The thing I think that was really important in bringing the Dutch and Mohawks together in the latter part of the 1630s and into the 1640s was the firearms trade. The Dutch had a much more liberal attitude toward making firearms and ammunition available as trade goods than any other colonial power in Eastern North America. The French, for example, on paper made conversion to Christianity a prerequisite for anyone who wanted to purchase a firearm. Okay, and the Dutch had no such scruples in that particular regard. And what you end up seeing here is by 1641, the Mohawks are described as being able to field 400 armed men. Dutch supplied firearms like shell wampum and brass kettles before them soon spread quite rapidly throughout Haudenosaunee nations. And I think it's this flourishing firearms trade that provides the basis of Dutch efforts to mend fences with the Haudenosaunee. In the hyper-competitive economic atmosphere in New Netherland that followed the West India Company's termination of its monopoly on the fur trade in 1639, Dutch officials realized that the Mohawks would be able to drive hard bargains with so many colonists competing for access to their beaver pelts. So they decided to lavish some diplomatic attention on the Haudenosaunee thereafter. Van Rensselaer abandoned his effort to collect the indemnity from the Mohawks, and he sent his camise, his chief representative, a guy named Arent van Curler, to Mohawk country in July of 1640 with, as it says, 3 very fine blankets for Mohawk leaders, a gift that was to signify the great friendship prevailing between the two nations, one that Van Rensselaer was clearly interested in rebooting, I guess you might say. 3 years later, Van Curler goes back to Mohawk country on an official errand, interestingly, to effect the ransom of the Jesuit Isaac Jogues from the Mohawks, who were then holding Jogues prisoner, along with 2 other Frenchmen. Okay, Van Curler opened his proposal to the Mohawks by saying, we, meaning the Dutch, should keep on good terms as neighbors, and they, meaning the Mohawks, should do no injury either to the colonists or to their cattle. Okay, leaders from all 3 Mohawk towns who listened to the speech thanked Van Curler for his verbalization of those terms. They may even have appreciated the offer of Dutch brokerage of Jogues' ransom as a means of repairing their strained relations with New France, but they declined Van Curler's offer of about 600 guilders, as it says, in goods for Jogues, preferring to try and manage his repatriation on their own terms. In reality, the Mohawks were actually using Jogues as a prop in efforts to convey their military might and thereby secure tribute payments from Native nations in the lower Hudson Valley, then embroiled in Keefe's War. Okay, they were basically taking payments to stay out of it. Okay, and using Jogues as kind of a manifestation of their ability to do great things. Jogues actually managed to escape to Fort Orange, and with the assistance of Dutch officials there and in Manhattan, was able to sneak off and sail back to France. The Mohawks were not very happy about this, but were essentially bought off later on with some gifts that persuaded them, as it says, to return home peacefully. Okay, and this actually became a quite lucrative business for the Mohawks, and one that came to cost the Dutch a great deal of money when they would bring prisoners of war, particularly from New France, into Fort Orange, and demand ransom payments from the Dutch, and then the Dutch would have to go try and track down reimbursement from French colonial officials, which wasn't always forthcoming. Okay, so the Mohawks are in particular are moving toward a position where they're able to leverage their diplomatic acumen and military power or its reputation for their own benefit and for the benefit of the Dutch themselves. Okay, the Mohawks helped the Dutch negotiate an end to Keefe's War with the Munsees and Mahikins of the lower Hudson Valley in 1645. Okay, and again, this leads to more Dutch subsidization, I should say, of the Mohawks' military power. Okay, we see evidence in the late 1640s of Dutch traders bringing large cargoes of arms and ammunition directly into Mohawk country to exchange for beaver pelts. By 1647, the Mohawks are requisitioning teams of horses and Dutch laborers to assist in hauling timber to reinforce their town's palisades, claiming this was their due in exchange for permitting the Dutch to reside at Rensselaerswyck. Between 1648 and 1650, the surviving documents speak of Mohawk parties regularly commandeering the patroon's house at Rensselaerswyck to collect gifts of Dutch military stores and tribute payments from so-called subsidiary nations of the lower Hudson Valley. Okay. In addition to the military and diplomatic recognition that the Mohawks are getting from the Dutch by mid-century, mid-17th century, another phenomenon that emerges into the record are a few people, not many, but a few, of mixed Mohawk and Dutch ancestry. Okay, most notably among these is a Mohawk later named Canaquis, who's also referred to as Smithian, John Smith, and by the French as the Flemish bastard. French Jesuits described Canaquis in colorful terms as an execrable issue of sin, the monstrous offspring of a Dutch heretic father and a pagan Mohawk mother. And recently, archaeologists have suggested that the Dutch only had limited interest in Mohawk women and vice versa. The documentary record, I think, tells us that there is some evidence to the contrary. Matrilineal descent reckoning among the Iroquois meant that individuals like Canaquis could be raised by Mohawks by their mothers, raised as Mohawks by their mothers without the stigma of illegitimacy. And such practices were actually normative among indigenous people in establishing mutual ties between different communities or nations, or as they said so at the time, making one people out of allied groups. Okay. Notwithstanding the sort of beginnings of some closer interpersonal ties, the Mohawks continued to labor to remind the Dutch of their obligations as allies in a Gaswenta relationship. 300 Mohawks arrived at Fort Orange on the 19th of November, 1655, asking for a renewal of harmony and peace with New Netherland, and stated their unhappiness, as they put it, of the not altogether brotherly demands of Dutch blacksmiths for payment for the repair of Mohawk firearms. The Dutch responded with a token gift of 15 bars of lead and 25 pounds of gunpowder. Evidently dissatisfied by this gesture, the Mohawks plundered a number of Dutch traders near Fort Orange, taking away by force guns, powder, shot, and coats. So you could see that occasionally these relations got a bit violent, got a bit rough. and people had difficulty understanding one another across a linguistic and cultural divide. Okay. The Dutch seem to have wised up a bit after that incident. There's another example in 1658 of Mohawks bringing another French Jesuit to Fort Orange, not as a captive, but more in a diplomatic capacity. They were actually trying to arrange for the Jesuit Simon Lemoyne to escort a Mohawk Dutch party to New France and negotiate what would have been a peace alliance between the Haudenosaunee, New France, and New Netherland. And what's fascinating is that the Dutch actually do send people who go with Lemoyne and the Mohawks to Quebec City in May of 1658. The French were not interested in the offer, but I think what's noteworthy is that the Dutch were willing to kind of assist in this Mohawk diplomatic initiative. So it was a kind of a game of back and forth, progress in certain ways. In other ways, Mohawks continued to voice complaints about their treatment at the hands of Dutch people. Okay, in 1659, Mohawk leaders appeared at Fort Orange and complained that, the Dutch say we are brothers and that we are joined together by chains, but that lasts only as long as we have beavers. After that, we are no longer thought of. And again, this was kind of a problem for them because the Mohawks are at this point engaged in multiple conflicts with a number of indigenous nations. They need a regular supply of arms and ammunition. They need the Dutch to step up to the terms of the alliance as they see it. Okay, so they make a pretty interesting laundry list of requests. They say, look, here's how you can fix the relationship. Here's how you can be our alliance partner. Okay, we need free repair of our firearms. We need 30 men with horses to haul logs to repair our palisades. We need actually, we would really like it if you would send 50 to 60 armed men from Fort Orange into Mohawk country to assist us in homeland security. Okay. So, you can kind of see here that the Dutch are being confronted by a pretty substantive, you could almost argue, in a way, an existential request at this point in time by Mohawks to sort of step up to the terms of their allegiance. And that particular speech elicited a very unusual, almost, I think it may be unique, example of Dutch authorities at Fort Orange actually going out into Mohawk country in 1659 to renew the friendship. Okay, they bring Van Curler with them. Okay, they recall explicitly his 1643 embassy. They brighten the so-called iron chain that had linked him with the Mohawks 16 years ago, as it says, and basically promise that henceforth you will have no reason to doubt that we shall be and remain brothers. Okay, they don't answer any of the specific grievances. They don't answer any of the specific requests, but what they do is leave a pretty significant gift of military materiel behind as kind of a gesture of their recognition of the terms of the alliance. Okay. But even that, a year later, Mohawk leaders are back again at Fort Orange complaining about ongoing physical assaults and verbal insults perpetrated by Dutch traders that threatened an end to the old friendship they said that they had enjoyed for more than 30 years. In July of 1660, Onondaga leaders came in and echoed these Mohawk complaints of abuses committed by Dutch traders outside the boundaries of Fort Orange and Beverwyck, and noted the inconsistency of having to rely on the Dutch at Fort Orange for gunpowder to fight Susquehannock enemies armed by Dutch traders on the Delaware River. Okay, so you can sort of see here that by 1660, the relationship had come to a bit of a crossroads. Mohawks repeatedly had articulated an agenda, an understanding of what they wanted out of it, what they thought was their due in this particular relationship. The Dutch don't seem quite willing to meet them kind of face to face on it. They attend to it. They try to sort of use material gifts to kind of buy their way into a a more peaceful relationship. And I think it's that at that moment you see the Haudenosaunee people, particularly the Mohawks, try something quite new. Okay, and that's not an actual picture of Arent Van Curler in the slide. That's a person at a pageant from 1912. But I think what happens in 1661 is very interesting, because you see three Mohawk headmen, one representing each of the nation's constituent clans, coming into Fort Orange and signing a deed that grants Arent Van Curler, and Arent Van Curler alone at this point in time, a tract of land in the vicinity of what's now Schenectady. In doing so, they basically surrendered or alienated territory they had claimed after their dispersal of the Mahikins. There weren't any Mohawks living there at this point in time. It was kind of unoccupied territory in their domain. But what they wanted to do was leverage this gift to Van Curler into a new Dutch trading post 24 miles closer to their easternmost settlement, and spare themselves the travel time from the Mohawk River to the increasingly rough and tumble trading scene at Fort Orange. They grounded their plans on growing ties of kinship with members of the Dutch settler population. These are personified at the time by Van Curler, who then had a 9-year-old daughter living with her mother's family in Mohawk country. Van Curler was a known quantity in the eyes of the Mohawks. He had a long track record of selling firearms to Haudenosaunee customers. And despite delays in surveying that deferred the settlement of the Schenectady Patent until 1664, and official bans on trading at Schenectady imposed by the Dutch and later English authorities, the Mohawks' sale, you might say, or gift of the Schenectady land, I think is best understood as reflecting their interest in deepening ties of mutual interest with the Dutch population. This was one of the first, if not the first, parcels of land ever granted by the Mohawks to a colonist, and it was really an important strategic decision. It increased Dutch competition in the fur trade. It brought Dutch settlers closer to Mohawk country, which would in theory make them more interested in questions of mutual security. And I think it really recognized Van Curler's ties of kinship with the Mohawks with an allocation of land. Carrying the story further, you could actually sort of say that this was an effort by the Mohawks to sort of show the Dutch what the benefits of a kinship connection might have been. Okay, so that's an initiative that's undertaken in 1661. Okay, 3 years later, the Haudenosaunee are engaged in their own wars on multiple fronts. They are not in a position to, and they offer no assistance to the Dutch when English forces compelled the surrender of New Netherland in September of 1664. Less than 3 weeks after the formal surrender in Manhattan, a delegation of Haudenosaunee headmen from all the League's constituent nations arrived at the former site of Fort Orange, now Fort Albany, to meet and confer with newly arrived English officials. Okay, and these were George Cartwright and Richard Nichols, treating on behalf of the Duke of York, who really sought to maintain the status quo as much as possible, since they recognized that the Haudenosaunee and Dutch had established an effective working partnership. So the treaty that is signed in 1664 is a very interesting document that does reflect, I think, a number of the themes of a Casuenta relationship. Okay, the English commit themselves to supplying trade goods at the same price and in the same quantities that the Dutch had done. Okay, they pledge to punish any offense committed by the settler population of New York against any native person. Okay, they ask for Haudenosaunee leaders to reciprocate on that particular idea of investigation, punishment, and compensation for crimes. Okay, the delegates from the Haudenosaunee accept the offer that's made by the English authorities, and also add in the final version of the treaty their right to free trade with other nations of their choosing, and the request for non-interference by the English in their wars with other nations. And one of the things they leave with the English authorities is this sketch map that's depicted on the slide of their homelands, which appears to have included national names and possibly the names of settlements that were imperfectly transcribed by the English recipients who were hearing these words for the first time. So we've kind of reached the conclusion of our expedited tour of Haudenosaunee Dutch relations. Okay, and I think what I'm hoping is that we can more fully appreciate the degree to which the principles of Geswenta were operative in the daily lives of settlers and native people alike in New Netherland. Okay, the Haudenosaunee were trying to incorporate these potentially valuable neighbors as allies while maintaining their sovereign nationhood. The Dutch, after a learning curve of some duration, I think toward the end of the regime, recognized the degree to which their interest would be served by a relationship of peers in separate vessels. Okay, these are, it's a relationship that evolves over time as ties between the Haudenosaunee and Dutch deepen and sociopolitical circumstances grew more complex, but they were real. Okay, documented Haudenosaunee oral tradition helps us to understand this. And when you look at how the Haudenosaunee speak in their dealings with the English after 1664, they use the term Brother Corlar in the documents as an homage to Van Curler, who passed away in 1667, as a means of encapsulating the tradition of the Dutch Haudenosaunee partnership. And this persisted until the time of Sir William Johnson in the 18th century, after about 1740, who, despite his antipathy toward his Dutch rivals in managing native affairs in New York, still acknowledged the legacy of his predecessors in his official seal, which you can actually see foregrounds the ship and canoe symbolism central to the idea of Geswenta. Okay, you see a European sailing vessel and a small depiction of two figures in a canoe. Okay, so by using that terminology that kind of evoked their former relationship with the Dutch, the Haudenosaunee were trying to commit the English to adhering to protocols that they had established early on in their encounters with New Netherland. Okay, opening diplomatic councils with the memory of Van Curler enable Haudenosaunee speakers to reassert the obligations inherent to Geswenta in the ensuing conversations. And for their part, the Dutch, after the 1664 conquest, also appropriated this relational language, echoing Haudenosaunee demands for peace and continuity during the transition to English rule, and leveraging their special knowledge and relationship with the Haudenosaunee to elevate themselves into a prominent role as diplomatic brokers between the English colonial government and the Haudenosaunee. Again, something that persisted until well into the 18th century, when it was finally kind of subordinated by the assent of Sir William Johnson. Okay, so I'm going to fast forward here to something that happened at the Hudson Quadricentennial, one of the conferences at the Hudson Quadricentennial of 1609. And this was from an event in the Netherlands in April of 2009. There was a commemoration conference at the Westerkerk in Amsterdam. And at the conclusion of the conference, a Mohawk individual depicted in the image there, a gentleman named Jerry Thundercloud McDonald, who hadn't been formally invited to the proceedings, actually stood up in the audience and delivered a quite compelling impromptu speech highlighting the history of the Geswenta relationship between the Haudenosaunee and the Dutch. And McDonald's unanticipated action resulted in a hastily arranged press conference the next day, during which he presented a replica Turo wampum belt to the deputy mayor of Amsterdam, shown there, a woman named Carolyn Garrels. And this, again, I think is a kind of incident that sort of reflects to us the ongoing effort that Haudenosaunee people have made up to and including the present day to educate those of us in the non-native community about constructive cross-cultural relations. And in this case, this is a relationship that's anchored in the early history of New Netherland. So when it's all said and done, you know, my argument here about this particular case study, my hope is that people can take away the sense that it really is incumbent upon scholars, when thinking about native oral tradition, especially regarding something as fundamentally significant as Goswenta, to go further than much of the research has to date gone, okay? It's not enough to simply identify a single document as a fake and dismiss the whole concept. It's not enough to set the bar for evidentiary proof of a concept's existence to impossible standards, such as requiring a surviving physical belt that can be explicitly associated with a documentary source. That's very rare, I'll submit to you, in the entirety of colonial North America. And it helps me to sort of, I think what I want to say here is that one of the oldest tricks in the colonizer's playbook has been to deny the authenticity or the antiquity of indigenous traditions. When European scholarship adopts these principles, it works to kind of conflate contemporaneous cultural and political differences between indigenous and settler nations into a temporal sequence, okay? When indigenous people, put it another way, when indigenous people are sort of shorn of a true past, they're placed in an inferior position behind in terms of their cultural development and thus susceptible to the demands of the colonizing mission. And I think in this case, it's really worth noting that the concept of Goswenta facilitates a fuller recognition of historical coevalness, the simultaneous coexistence of others with their own historical trajectories, with their own stories to tell. And when we analyze the history of this particular relationship, I think we get the opportunity to raise our understanding of how Haudenosaunee people built a sense of cross-cultural relationships that works towards unity, not uniformity. And we get a sense of understanding how the first treaties and agreements with Europeans were not so much about emphasizing the specific rights obtained than they were about the responsibilities and duties each party had toward the other to ensure a shared future, a future in which differences between individuals, communities, and nations can be acknowledged and integrated rather than annihilated or absorbed. So that's where I'll stop for now, and I'm certainly happy to take questions that Patrick can mediate.
Yep.
I appreciate your attention to what turned out to be a little longer than I probably intended, but hopefully it went fast for you.
No, it was great. It was very informative. There are a few questions that came through. There's one that came through pretty early, and I think you touched on a little bit, but maybe you could touch on a little bit more. Referencing some of the other indigenous people that were living here, is it true that Hudson and crew encountered other indigenous groups farther south of Albany who were not Iroquois, but many other tribes? And maybe just a little bit about the relationship between the Haudenosaunee and some of those other.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I sort of struggled with that when I was trying to do this, because my expertise is not in those Algonquian populations. But what's very interesting about the literature on early Dutch New Netherland is that in many cases, the way in which their relationships are constructed with these different entities is treated in a very sort of separate way. For example, the Dutch had a much more violent relationship with the Algonquian nations in the lower Hudson Valley than they did with the Haudenosaunee. And that relates, I think, to a basic power dynamic. Okay, the Dutch were in a position by about 1640 of military superiority to those groups, and they were much more willing and able to push them around by that point in time than they ever did with the Mohawks or Haudenosaunee after Van Kriekenbeck's unfortunate experiment. So yes, Hudson and the Dutch do have a very extensive series of relationships with people in what's the lower Hudson Valley now. They're modeled on kind of a agreement between equals, I would say, but I don't think they actually manifest themselves in that way. In other words, the Dutch are much more willing to flex their muscle against those groups than they are with the Haudenosaunee, and that makes the relationship a bit different. Okay, and you never see the kinds of violence directed by the Dutch as they do on several occasions toward the lower Hudson Valley people, toward the Mohawks or any of the Haudenosaunee at that point. But
there's a question, just if you could reprovide the citation for the graphic novel that you
yeah,
referenced in the
maybe
presentation.
what I could do, yeah, let's see, it's called, it has the same title. It's Journey into Mohawk and Oneida Country. The author is George O'Connor, and that's O'Connor with an OR at the end. And it was published in 2006 by a company called First Second Publishers. I think it's still in print. I actually assigned it to a class one time a few years ago, and it was tremendously successful. I mean, it's a really interesting, accessible way for people to get into the past. And I'll be honest with you, I was quite skeptical of this from the beginning. I thought, well, it's a comic book. What are we going to learn from this? But actually, it's very well done. The decision to represent the historical figures in kind of an unrealistic, kind of cartoony way, I think spared a lot of the potential problems with visual depictions of this particular time period. But it's a quite well done thing. Yeah, it's Journey into Mohawk Country is the short title. I think if you, and I believe it's still in print. I'm not 100% sure, but yeah.
John asked, the plate showing the escalated trade using arms includes a number of barrels. To what extent was rum used in trade?
Yeah, the Dutch do not have a great deal of scruples about alcohol. They were willing to trade alcohol at quite significant volumes. So yes, it is indeed significant. There would occasionally be times where Haudenosaunee people would come into Fort Orange and ask that it be toned down a bit because of the problems it was creating. So I think you could say that by the end of the Dutch regime in the late 1650s, early 1660s, alcohol had been traded at a level that had the potential to create issues in these communities. I don't think it would be accurate to say that it had created widespread addiction in Iroquois at this point in time, but I would certainly say that, yeah, it's present. And again, the Dutch, their restrictions on trade are far fewer than even with the French at this point in time, and that makes them attractive trading partners to the Haudenosaunee as well. So yes, rum is, I couldn't speak to the exact proportion, but it's certainly quite prevalent in the trade. Probably, it's certainly subordinate to arms and ammunition, but it's up there as a trade good that the Haudenosaunee are interested in.
There's another question about contacts in the 1609 about weren't Henry Hudson's initial Native American contacts with Mahikins?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, they were. But there's also some evidence to suggest that the people around Albany, the 3 days he spent there in September of 1609, included Mohawks at some point as well. Okay, just because, and I say that because, and this is actually something that was new to me. There's some radiocarbon dating on artifacts that have come back, and it's a colleague of mine at Cornell who's on the research team. And the dates for the Dutch goods in Mohawk country are much earlier than traditionally were thought. So it's pretty clear that they had to have come either from Hudson or very shortly thereafter. I mean, the Dutch are back in 1610 and 1611 and 1612, not Hudson himself, but other people. And, you know, it's quite clear that the Mohawks were involved with this at an early stage. Exactly what the relationship between the residency, I mean, the Mahikins are in the vicinity of Albany at this point as well. The Mohawks' main residences are about 50 miles west, but it's quite clear that the Mohawks were there and getting stuff at a very early point in time, earlier than we thought, up until even earlier this year. The research has just been done. So it's now fairly clear that they were involved in this too.
A question about production of wampum beads. So the Dutch engaged in the production of wampum beads. How extensive was their involvement in this activity?
Initially, what the Dutch tried to do was basically get it from native producers in the Connecticut River Valley. They couldn't quite keep up with the volume, so they ended up actually producing it themselves. And I can't remember the date of the first. There are actually like proto factories producing this in New Netherland. I would say by the 1640s for sure. They might have been as early as the 1630s, but the Dutch began producing it themselves, using, metal technology to get it going on an economy of scale. So yes, they are producing it themselves, and relying on themselves as a supplier when their native sources couldn't quite keep up with the demand. And you have to understand that this was really the main vector of shell wampum into the Northeast at this point in time. It's not produced in New France at all. The materials aren't available. The shell isn't available. So it's quite valuable commodity that Haudenosaunee people, whose territory expands and extends between what's New Netherland and New France, they're able to sort of use this as a very kind of important economic resource.
Are there other documented examples of similar Gaswenta type relationships between indigenous tribes and European settlers in other areas of the United States?
I mean, that's not something I could answer specifically, but I would think that in other areas where you have a relationship of parity, which we kind of have in New Netherland for quite a bit longer than in most other colonial settings at this point in time, that would be the place to look. So I think there's some aspects of the French relationship with the Haudenosaunee that do model this to a point. Excuse me. And I think, there's other areas in the Southeast when the Spanish come back after their sort of entradas of the 16th century, when they come back in the 17th century and try to kind of stabilize relationships, you might see it there. But in terms of something that's elaborated as extensively as this, I'm not familiar with anything else. Okay, this may be fairly unique in the sense that what you have here is a relationship between colonizers and indigenous people that largely worked for a number of decades simply because the settlement pressure that the Dutch brought to bear on the upper Hudson River Valley was so little for so long. Okay, they were not really, they basically stayed within the patent of Rensselaerswyck, Beverwyck. They did not sort of push into the peripheries of Haudenosaunee territory in any really substantive way, at least during the Dutch regime. It happens later. But during the Dutch period, there's a very kind of arm's length, in a way, relationship that kind of works. And I think that's the really unique thing about this, that you don't see, and certainly you don't see it in New England. You don't see it in other parts of Anglo-colonial America, where that settlement territorial push ends up leading to larger scale native resistance and violence much more quickly than you see here. In Ithaca, where I am, there weren't any real Europeans out here at all until after the 7 Years' War, into the Revolutionary period, and it's actually the Sullivan-Clinton campaign that opens this area up to settlement, and that's in almost 100 years later. Okay, so it's very interesting to see how the Haudenosaunee were able to kind of benefit from a relationship early on that did respect to a great degree their territorial integrity. And I think that really has something to say about why this persisted for as long as it did, and why their memory of it was something they stressed over and over. Okay, it's something they wanted to remember. They wanted to teach other people about it. They wanted to restore those kinds of conditions, that because in their minds they worked.
How would you characterize the influence of Adrian Vanderdonk with the Iroquois?
Well, Vanderdonk, it's been a while since I've looked at Vanderdonk, but I know that Vanderdonk had kind of an interesting opinion of Haudenosaunee people. It wasn't always positive. Okay, I'm not sure how much he influenced them. His representation of them in his text wasn't particularly positive in certain ways. Okay, and I think it does kind of reflect a phenomenon that some other scholars who've been writing about this. There's a very good study by a woman named Deborah Hamer that just came out that talks a little bit about the distaste Dutch people had for Native individuals. Okay, they didn't like them very much. They wanted to do business with them, but they didn't want to, I guess you could say, hang out. They didn't want to spend a lot of time with them. They found Native people to be, in their view, uncivilized, and they kept their distance. Okay, and sometimes that led to saying pretty negative things about them. I mean, other times, it just basically meant that there were limits to how far the Dutch were going to go in terms of getting to know Native people, in terms of associating with them and dealing up front. So I couldn't really speak to what kind of influence Vanderdonk had on the Haudenosaunee themselves, but certainly his narrative would have influenced other Dutch opinion about this, I think, in some interesting ways. Okay, it was one of few, it's almost a proto-ethnography in many ways.
The last question looks like that has come through. Can you comment on the role of intermarriage between Mohawks and Dutch during those times?
Oh, it's interesting because there isn't a single recorded marriage. It was all outside the boundaries of Christian marriage at this point in time. There is not a single recorded marriage between a Dutch person and a Haudenosaunee and a Haudenosaunee person during the Dutch period. There are some later in Schenectady and places like that. As we get into the 18th century, the populations do begin to kind of engage in formal marriages where you see godparenting and all these other kinds of things come into play. But prior to 1604, there is not a single Christian blessed union between a Mohawk woman and a Dutch man. And that's been kind of, the Deborah Hamer piece I mentioned talks about this, and she kind of sees this as something that reflects in a way the unwillingness of the Dutch to kind of sanction these kinds of things, and or I guess you could all say admit to it, own it at a certain level. And that's true, but on the Mohawk side of the equation, it wasn't really that important to them. The women, because descent was reckoned through Mohawk women, the kids were theirs. They were raised in the community, and the Dutch father didn't necessarily need to be around at a certain level. Okay, and there aren't many of these. Okay, you could probably count on two hands the number we know about that occur between during the Dutch regime. They do have kind of an outsized diplomatic importance with Conaque's Van Curler's daughter. There's another woman named Hillety Van Olinda who's an interpreter. So there are some ways in which they're quite influential, but there aren't many. Okay, and again, you sort of see that also kind of works, because if it was a problem, it would have fouled the relationship up, I think, quite a bit. You can see sentiments kind of going south very quickly over situations like that. Relations where unwanted children are being left in these Mohawk communities, but it wasn't happening at such a scale. And there were some people, I think, who really wanted to kind of slowly use that as a strategy to kind of build up a better relationship between the two communities by creating a population of people who could communicate with both sides, who had excuse me, familiarity and understanding with both sides' cultures. Okay, you just see the very beginnings of that experiment, I think, with Van Curler and the Schenectady patent. And it does get more extensive in the 18th century, but not during the 17th. So
there was a comment just based on your, so Ellen said that depending on what you mean by quote unquote marriage, one of her ancestors, Cornelius van Schleich, had a form of marriage with a Mohawk woman. They had 4 children who were interpreters when they were adults.
That's Hillety van Olindis. I mean, you could argue that certainly from the standard of the Mohawk community, some of these unions would have been seen as marriages. Okay, that's certainly true, and I didn't mean to diminish that. But it is also the case that the Dutch did not recognize any of them as legal at that point in time. They certainly recognized the significance of the children who emerged from those unions and their utility and importance to sustaining the relations, but they never permitted an official, Dutch Reformed church wedding, I guess you could say. So.
Well, thank you.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think that looks like it's the last of the questions that came through.
Okay.
So I want to thank you, Dr. Parmenter,
you're
for your time this afternoon, for your presentation. It was very informative. I want to thank everybody who spent time with us this evening. So thank you all for taking part in this presentation and asking all of those wonderful questions. And I hope everybody has a great rest of their day and the rest of their evening.
Okay, great. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Have a great night.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it, folks. Have a good evening.
Thank you.